Mutations. Genes. You learned in 6th grade science that multicellular organisms can be made up of millions, billions, or trillions of cells. With so many cells in an organism, how do they all know exactly what to do? In the nucleus of each cell is a set of instructions. The instructions for the cells in your body are coded in genes. Genes determine the traits or characteristics that an individual has. Genes are grouped together on structures called chromosomes. All organisms, whether they reproduce sexually or asexually, pass genetic information to their offspring. Sexual reproduction. Most cells of sexually reproducing organisms contain pairs of chromosomes. For example, in humans, most cells have 23 pairs of chromosomes, making 46 chromosomes in total. Each chromosome contains a version of a gene. These two versions are called alleles. Each biological parent has to produce sex cells, egg cells, or sperm cells before sexual reproduction can occur. Sex cells have half the number of chromosomes as regular cells. Because of this, sex cells have only one allele for each trait. During fertilization, the male and female sex cells combine, as shown in the diagram of human fertilization that follows. For each gene, an offspring receives one allele from the female sex cell and another from the male sex cell. This new combination of alleles is called a genotype. Depending on the alleles received from each biological parent, the offspring's genotype could be identical to one biological parent, identical to both biological parents, or could be a new genotype made from a combination of genes from both of the biological parents. Because of this, sexual reproduction is one source of genetic variation in populations. Human female sex cell. 23 chromosomes, one allele for each trait. Human male sex cell. 23 chromosomes, one allele for each trait. Fertilization. Offspring. 46 chromosomes, two alleles for each trait. Genetic variation is a measure of how similar or different individuals in a population are. One way variation can be measured is by choosing a trait and seeing how many different genotypes are found in the population. Variation can also be measured by looking at phenotypes because we know they are determined by genes. As we previously discussed, a phenotype is the state of the trait that an organism displays. White fur, black fur, and orange fur are all phenotypes of the fur color trait for cats. A population of cats that all have orange fur has less genetic variation than a population with some cats that have white fur, some with black fur, and some with orange fur. Stop and check. How does sexual reproduction lead to genetic variation? What are two ways to measure the genetic variation of a population? Asexual reproduction. Populations that reproduce asexually, such as all species of bacteria, have less genetic and trait variation than populations that reproduce sexually. This is because it involves one parent who passes all of its genes to its offsprings. Because of this, the offspring will share the same phenotypes as the parents. Proteins. Just like cats and humans, all living organisms are made of cells that contain genes. Now, let us take a closer look at the fruit fly, a common insect in our city. Scientists study fruit fly genes and have determined which genes control different parts of the fruit fly. Most genes contain instructions that direct an organism's cells to make specific proteins, a type of molecule found in all living organisms. Proteins have many functions in living organisms. Proteins can make up the structures of organisms, carry out vital functions such as energy processing, and signal the growth of large structures like wings, eyes, or antennae in a fruit fly. In the fruit fly diagram that follows, the green bar represents a chromosome. Each light blue area on the chromosome represents a different gene. These genes control which proteins are made, which in turn determine the fruit fly traits we observe. There are genes that control the color of the fruit fly's eyes and other genes that control the size of the fly's wings. If the genes were to change in some way, it could send a message to cells to make a different protein. Making a different protein could then lead to a physical change. We see that a change in one gene can alter the fly's eye color from red to brown, and a change to a different gene can affect the fly's wing size. In the diagram, fruit fly A has common traits and fruit fly B's genes were changed in some way. This change in the genes affected the proteins made, which resulted in new or uncommon traits. Fruit fly A, fruit fly B. How do mutations happen? Mutations are changes to genes that can affect the gene's instructions to make a particular protein. Mutations can occur when errors are made as cells copy genetic material to pass on to a new cell. Mutations can also occur when genes are damaged by an external factor, such as too much ultraviolet radiation from the sun, chemicals in polluted water, or viruses transmitted through disease. New cells are constantly being made in an organism, so accidental changes to genes or mutations have many opportunities to occur. Luckily, organisms have systems in place to correct most accidental changes that occur, so mutations are rare. However, some of these accidental changes do not get corrected and a mutation occurs. Most of the time, a mutation remains in the individual organism and is not passed down to offspring. However, when a mutation occurs in the genetic material of a sex cells, sperm or egg, of organisms that reproduce sexually, the mutation can be passed from one generation to the next. In organisms that reproduce asexually, all of their genes are copied and passed on to their offspring. This means that all mutations that occur will be passed down to offspring. Mutations are another source of genetic variation in all populations, regardless of whether they reproduce sexually or asexually. Stop and check. What is a mutation? How can mutations lead to physical changes? What effects do mutations have on organisms? It is important to understand that mutations aren't all bad or good. Some mutations have negative or harmful effects, some mutations have positive or beneficial effects, and some mutations are neutral, meaning they have no noticeable effect at all. The effect of mutations depends on many factors, such as the function of the protein involved and the environment in which the organism lives. Harmful mutations. Sometimes a mutation can lead to diseases or disorders in an organism. For example, albino redwood trees have a mutation that makes them unable to produce chlorophyll, which is needed for photosynthesis. These trees have to take sugar from neighboring trees through their roots. They are called albino redwoods because the lack of chlorophyll makes their needles white instead of green. Beneficial mutations. Sometimes mutations help an organism. For example, one type of mutation prevents some people from developing high cholesterol, which reduces the chance of these people developing heart disease. In the video you watched in the Engage lesson, you saw an example of a mutation that had a positive effect on some bacteria. The mutation led to traits that allow the bacteria to resist the effects of antibiotics. This mutation has helped the bacteria survive. Neutral mutations. Sometimes mutations result in no noticeable changes in traits at all. In these cases, either the change in the gene does not affect the protein built or change in protein has no noticeable effect on the organism. Sometimes a mutation does result in a noticeable change in traits, but it does not affect the organism in a positive or negative way. This would also be an example of a neutral mutation. Stop and check. Do mutations always have a bad effect on organisms?